Goldeneye.
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 Hey there, did you ever want to watch a Goldeneye retrospective that's half as long as the movie itself? Well, you're in the right place. We're going deep for this retrospective. We're talking foreground, background, midground. It's a 4D retrospective. That's right, Bond history, the books, the game. We're going to go through the whole movie. Interviews, DVD commentary, behind the scenes featurettes. I read the original script. It's a retrospective on the most important James Bond film in the entire franchise, Goldeneye. It came out after the longest gap between any two Bond films, the collapse of the Soviet Union, a legal battle that almost destroyed the James Bond franchise itself. So buckle up. We gotta start with the history, but if you don't care about that, check the timestamps and jump to the movie. Ian Fleming published the first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, in 1953. However, the origin of Goldeneye actually precedes the James Bond books themselves. Ian Fleming was a commander in the British Naval Intelligence Division during the Second World War. He is credited with formulating Operation Goldeneye, which was a contingency plan for the Allies in the event that Germany invaded Gibraltar through Spain. The name Goldeneye became inspiration for Ian Fleming's estate in Jamaica. Here, for 12 years straight, he would take a yearly vacation and write a new James Bond novel. The name for the estate was also influenced by a 1941 novel, Reflections in a Golden Eye, penned by Carson McCullers. The Bond novels were quite popular in their British homeland soon after Casino Royale was released. However, the books gained a wider appeal when one of Fleming's novels, From Russia with Love, found its way to the colonies. In 1961, US President John F. Kennedy listed the book as one of his favorites of all time. In that same fateful year, 1961, Harry Saltzman would successfully purchase movie rights for the sixth James Bond novel, Dr. No. Shortly thereafter, he would be introduced to Albert R. Cubby Broccoli, and this shaking of hands would result in the formation of the Everything or Nothing production company, bringing the legendary assassin to the big screen. And a year later, in 1962, Dr. No, starring Sean Connery as James Bond, would premiere in the United Kingdom. Connery would ultimately star in 7 James Bond movies, with 6 of them being in the official Everything or Nothing canon.
Bond. James Bond.
Following him, George Lazenby would play Bond for a single film.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
Roger Moore, 7.
Yes, my name is Bond. James Bond.
Timothy Dalton, 2.
Bond. James Bond.
Pierce Brosnan, 4.
Name's Bond. James Bond.
And Daniel Craig, 5 James Bond movies.
Name's Bond. James Bond.
The story of Goldeneye also has connections to the end of Roger Moore's tenure as James Bond. Roger Moore left with the record of the longest tenure of 12 years, as well as the record of most official Bond films of any actor to play the British secret agent. Roger Moore concluded his 7-movie Bond tenure with 1985's A View to a Kill at a ripe old age of 57. The Moore era's crown jewel is assuredly 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me, which was based on the name, but not content, of the 10th book in Ian Fleming's series. The Spy Who Loved Me is by far Moore's most traditionally formed Bond film, and is juxtaposed next to 6 films that can be charitably described as campy, containing moments such as Cajun blaxploitation voodoo magic, triple-nippled villains with bite-sized henchmen, Bond in space with space lasers, talking parrots, Bond dressed as a clown, and Bond skiing to the Beach Boys. A View to a Kill was ultimately a critical disappointment and failed to top the box office on its opening weekend. Roger Moore publicly retired from the role, but according to Albert R. Cubby Broccoli's biography, When the Snow Melts, he decided to let Roger Moore go. With the search for a new actor and a reevaluation of the Bond franchise for a new era of cinema, the producers looked to bring Bond back in line with the tone of Fleming's novels as well as the earlier movies. Numerous actors were in talks with the producers to take over the mantle of Bond from Roger Moore. Timothy Dalton had been previously considered for the role of Bond several times. He was initially offered the role to replace Sean Connery following Diamonds Are Forever, but declined because he felt he was too young for the role, being in his mid-20s. Partway through Roger Moore's tenure at the start of the 1980s, Dalton was approached during For Your Eyes Only to replace Moore, but again declined because he disagreed with the direction the films had been taking.
Before you go too long, you've become a parody of yourself. The movies have become somewhat pastiche. You've lost depth, you've lost texture, you've lost contradictions. You start to get shallow.
After Moore retired in 1986, Timothy Dalton was again approached about the part and accepted, contingent that they could push filming 6 weeks due to his prior commitments shooting Brenda's Star. The producers were impatient and offered the role instead to a young Pierce Brosnan after a 3-day screen test.
By this time, they were looking for Bond to do The Living Daylights. And my name was in the hat. I auditioned, and I got it.
An Irish actor currently starring in the television show Remington Steele.
I got this great role in a series called Remington Steele, and Remington Steele put me on the map. Then in '86, they canceled the show. But there was a clause in the Remington Steele contract where they had 60 days in which to resell the show.
However, in an ironic twist of fate, the circulating prospect of Brosnan as Bond renewed interest in Remington Steele.
Everything's looking good. I'd already done the photographs. I'd stood there by the sound stage with the classic pose. It's day 60. We're off to the races.
Till recently, the new 007 was to have been TV's Remington Steele, Pierce Brosnan. You apparently missed out on the part when NBC decided to pick up the MTM-produced series after it had been canceled.
I was first asked to do it in 1986 and couldn't do it, couldn't get out of my contract with the Remington Steele.
The producers decided to renew his contract at the last possible moment, preventing Brosnan from proceeding as Bond due to his contractual obligations to Remington Steele.
Why did it go so wrong?
While this series of events unfolded, Timothy Dalton completed shooting of his role in Brenda's Star. And now, Timothy Dalton was available to star in The Living Daylights as James Bond.
We have a new James Bond. Now it's Dalton, Timothy Dalton, a Welsh actor who's more used to playing Shakespeare than secret agent.
Dalton would ultimately approach the character differently than his predecessors.
I guess I've always liked a challenge.
An emotional, vulnerable, and serious interpretation of Bond.
You can always identify with the James Bond of the books. I mean, he's very much a man, and a tarnished man, really.
What makes these movies work? What is it that got them going?
Dalton aimed to draw heavily from the character as he saw it in Ian Fleming's novels. Although unique from his predecessors, this is not what makes Bond work. Bond is a character, a sort of a mythological action hero. Bond does not need three-dimensionality. He needs to embody a very specific one-dimensional entity. A man all men want to be and all women want to be with. As this mythological action hero, he is the kind of man that doesn't really exist in the real world. And paradoxically, the more human he becomes, the less entertaining he is. And this is precisely where Dalton's interpretation of Bond failed. He aimed to make Bond human, and in making him human, he made Bond boring.
Every man wants to be infallible. Every man wants to win. Every man wants to get the girl. Every man wants to be number one.
Fast forward to the future, and we see a similar interpretation of Bond by Daniel Craig, who starred in a reboot following Brosnan's negatively received Die Another Day in 2002, starting with Casino Royale.
I meant for warm-blooded, heterosexual adults.
Dalton's second film, License to Kill, released in 1989 and flopped at the box office, being the lowest-grossing Bond movie of all time. Despite this, pre-production on the next Bond film began and a polished script was generated. However, a very convoluted legal and financial situation between MGM/United Artists, Danjaq, who were the Bond rights holders, and Kintex stalled production of the movie through a series of back-and-forth lawsuits. After years of legal dispute, the matter was eventually settled, and in 1993, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer sought to move forward with Bond 17. However, Timothy Dalton's 3-movie, 7-year contract expired in 1990, effectively ending his tenure as Bond. Timothy Dalton and Cubby Broccoli discussed him continuing with the role. However, due to the long hiatus, Broccoli wanted Dalton to do more than one additional film. Dalton did not want to play this character for an extended period of time and become defined by it, so they chose to part ways. The momentum of the franchise had been shaken, and the producers began stirring the pot in search of the next Bond. Many actors were approached to replace Dalton. Both Mel Gibson and Liam Neeson turned the role down. Liam Neeson is understandable. This would have been quite the thematic jump from 1993's Schindler's List. Paul McGann, of Doctor Who fame, was rumored to be taking the part if Pierce Brosnan was to turn it down. In addition, of particular note, both Sean Bean and Ralph Fiennes auditioned for the role to replace Dalton. Both were rejected. This would be Sean Bean's second vying for the Bond mantle, having previously auditioned against Brosnan and Dalton for the movie that would ultimately become The Living Daylights. He of course would end up playing the villain of Goldeneye, Alec Trevelyan. Ralph Fiennes would again audition for the role after Pierce Brosnan, but again would be beat out, this time by Daniel Craig. However, he would ultimately be cast as M in 2012's Skyfall to replace Judi Dench. Ultimately though, Pierce Brosnan would end up being the next James Bond, all these years after missing out on the role due to his Remington Steele contract. Brosnan's Bond, much like Dalton's, can be seen as a reactionary interpretation to its predecessor. Dalton aimed to double down on the brooding darkness of Fleming's Bond and humanize him, a contrast to Roger Moore's campiness. Pierce Brosnan's interpretation of Bond marriages the coldness of Dalton with a bit of the lightheartedness of Moore and the coolness of Connery. Rather than being emotional like Dalton's Bond, he would be an immovable object in the rapidly changing post-Soviet world, an immutable force upon which the chaos of those who opposed him would break themselves upon. Pierce Brosnan was the stoic interpretation of Bond. Goldeneye would have a big first. The first James Bond not produced by Albert Broccoli. Albert Broccoli appointed his daughter, Barbara Broccoli, and longtime employee Michael G. Wilson as co-producers to replace him in 1990 while taking a step back and overseeing production as consulting producer. With the desire to bring a fresh Bond into the new era, a decision was made also to use a new director instead of continuing with John Glenn, who had directed the previous 5 most recent Bond films. Martin Campbell was chosen to direct.
Martin Campbell could put the fear of God in one. One of his great directing notes was sharp as a knife, 150%.
He was the first non-Brit to direct a James Bond movie. He would later return for Daniel Craig's 2006 Bond introduction, Casino Royale, which, side note, like Goldeneye, was an absolute banger.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Another fun piece of trivia, it is reported that John Woo, like the John Woo, was the producer's first choice to direct the movie due to the large number of action scenes in the original script. But he declined. You know, in retrospect, seeing what John Woo did with Mission Impossible 2, this is probably for the best. All right, ladies and gentlemen, strap into your little Nellies. We're about to dive into the movie. But first, let's talk about the script. Michael France wrote the first draft of Bond 17 in 1993, what would eventually evolve into the Goldeneye we know today. But he would only retain a story by credit in the final film. Barbara Broccoli thought it was too unstructured and gave it to Jeffrey Kane for a rewrite. Kevin Wade did a 3-week punch-up, and his name would be inspiration for the character named Jack Wade in the final movie. Michael France stated that in preparation for the script, he traveled to Russia and interviewed KGB agents and explored nuclear research facilities. And this is right after the Soviet Union collapsed. In the Goldeneye DVD commentary, Martin Campbell called the process of refining the script, quote-unquote, agonizing. He also noted that they did not want to leave a lot on the cutting room floor. In total, only 2 or 3 scenes were cut, amounting to about 3 minutes of footage, and everything else were trims to existing content that ended up in the final film. It was Michael G. Wilson's idea to frame the movie in the post-Cold War era after the collapse of the Soviet Union. At the time, there were fear of, hold on to your hats, W.
Weapons of mass destruction.
The new James Bond would examine the character after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the loss of his primary adversary since the inception of Bond itself, the Soviets. Bond would face the criticism of his relevance in the modern day head-on, and critiques of his role in the social landscape, such as Bond being sexist.
I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur.
And women's role in the Bond franchise. And that's about what we get. Goldeneye is a postmodern deconstruction of James Bond. Let's break apart the Bond formula and the Bond character and put them together in a new way to fit with the changing times. This is what Brosnan's Bond feels like. Not the wittiest, the darkest, the strongest, but an amalgam of all the Bonds. A distillation. Concentrated into a Bond for the new age, thematically in sync with the Soviet deconstruction and the end of the Cold War.
Russians have behaved in a very villainous way since the war.
Okay, but what about the OG script? The OG Michael France original script? Michael France's original script produced a story that was incredibly similar to the final product. I would say he deserves more than a story by credit for Goldeneye. It's also apparent that the original treatment was clearly written for Dalton. It's got Pushkin. It's got Gimli.
Salted pork.
However, despite the large congruence with the final script, there are some interesting differences. The Goldeneye space weapon was originally called Tempest in the first draft. Tempest was utilized by Trevelyan to blow up the 7+2 Towers Center instead of London, killing millions of people and making him a lot of money. Very similar to what happens in the final movie, but instead of blowing up Big Ben, it's 7+2. Speaking of Trevelyan, Trevelyan was originally envisioned as an older mentor figure in the original draft, and his name was Augustus Trevelyan instead of Alec Trevelyan. Augustus Trevelyan was the former head of MI6. He was literally M, but he defected to the Soviets because he thought communism was awesome, I guess. I think someone forgot to read their Solzhenitsyn. His backstory of being a Lien's Cossack did not exist. He was just an opportunist.
I want, me, mine, now.
And it was reported that Anthony Hopkins turned down the role for Augustus Trevelyan, so we could have had an Anthony Hopkins villain. I've also seen that they tried to get Anthony Hopkins for some of the later Brosnan movies as well. This would have been awesome. Hannibal Lecter, James Bond villain. Yes, please. And then they also reportedly tried to get Alan Rickman, Big Boy Snape, probably because of Die Hard. But for me, it's always been,
thy grandfather's hammer, you shall be avenged.
Galaxy Quest. Watch it. It's great. But honestly, it's hard to imagine anyone else as Alec Trevelyan other than Sean Bean. He brings kind of this gritty working class vibe and nails the bitterness and the venom of a man who defines his family and his family's legacy as betrayal. And this works really well thematically, this being a Bond reboot, juxtaposing a new Brosnan Bond against his dark alter ego. You can see the character against his mirror. Two men of excess, one for the good, maintaining the status quo in the Western world as deemed appropriate by British MI6, and one bad to disrupt said status quo in the name of excess and revenge. And Martin Campbell said that it was vital to pick someone that they felt could have been Bond. So how apt they picked Sean Bean, because he auditioned twice and they didn't want him either time, but they wanted him for this role, and we all won because of it. The Trevelyan character also does this really good job of kind of humanizing Bond by giving him this ex-best friend, foster brother relationship. They explore the brother angle with Bond again in Spectre. Oh, don't get me started. You know what? Let's just move on. Trevelyan, the name Trevelyan, is a tongue-in-cheek reference to John Trevelyan, a film critic and censor who was particularly scornful of the Bond movies during the golden heyday in the 1960s. He called the Bond character callously sadistic in his 1973 memoir, What the Censor Saw.
And I think people like the action.
Goldeneye premiered on November 14th, 1995, and was a critical and financial success. Sorry, video outro in the future. I spoiled your build-up. Anyways, Goldeneye, despite everything working against it, it saved Bond and reinvigorated the franchise. People love the story, people love the action, people love the Bond, people love the stunts, people love the characters, people love the gadgets, people love the ladies. And yeah, it's a nearly perfect Bond film. One of the best, if not the best, top 5 for sure. Alright, now the fun part. Let's talk about the movie. And boom, we are in the movie already. We start off with the gun barrel sequence.
All you have to do is walk across the stage and shoot. Easier said than done.
It is a serviceable gun barrel sequence. I don't really see how anybody could have a new or innovative take on a James Bond gun barrel sequence. It works, it gets the job done. He doesn't trip and fall. This is the one they use in the next 4 movies, and I think this is the first one with CGI.
Well, I'm pretty satisfied with it.
Then we are at the dam. Movie starts off right away, not wasting any time. This is probably the best pre-title sequence in the whole franchise. I don't really know what would even compare to this. Honestly, all 4 of Brosnan's pre-title sequences are bonkers. And fun fact in the title card, this takes place in the year 1986. That is the year Dalton took over as Bond, as if to say to the audiences, hey, this wasn't the right direction for Bond, Timothy Dalton. Let's pick it up from where you started and pretend this didn't happen. This one is great. 2 minutes in, we are jumping off a dam. This whole shot is real, one take. Amazing.
And so in order to get physics of it right, they wanted to do a test of this jump. So they cut down a tree the same height and weight as my stunt double, Wayne Michaels. They threw it off the dam, and 3 times it snapped. They spent a number of weeks waiting for the right conditions. And finally one day they went up and they said, let's do it, let's jump. He stood and he took the position of the swan dive, and he looked over to his right with the crane that was going to winch him back up, and the crane driver just blessed himself. And they said, action.
Normally these James Bond movies, you have a big climax in the pre-title sequence with a big stunt. Here, no, 2 minutes in, stunt. And we're going to close out with another real stunt, a guy jumping off the runway with the motorcycle. Yeah, and there's a deleted scene. A couple guards in a guard shack. Pierce Brosnan sneaks in there, presses a button to then run out into the dam like the real movie starts. They got rid of this. in favor of just having him, boom, be running right away. I think it's a good change. This scene doesn't really add anything. It's pretty boring. Then he goes, pew, and we get him cutting the laser, and he ends up in the lavatory. The first time we see Pierce Brosnan as Bond, he is hanging upside down in a toilet.
And this is my introduction as James Bond. Photographs and images that one will live with for a lifetime.
Beg your pardon. Forgot to knock.
This is not a good way to bring Bond back after 6 years, Martin Campbell. Why are we sacrificing Bond's dignity for a little introductory gaffe? This is a new Bond, a new era. I don't like it. Then Bond steps to a pantry, and out of the shadows comes Trevelyan, Sean Bean as Alec Trevelyan. He steps out of the shadows into the light as if to say, hey, I'm not bad, I'm good. But spoiler alert, he's bad. We get this cool Tarantino-esque shot, and Alex says, James for England.
James? For England.
Kind of interesting, when the movie ends right before James Bond drops Trevelyan, he says, for England, James.
For England, James?
So it starts off, James for England, then it ends, for England, James. I don't know if this is some type of critical theory, literary symmetry thing or what, but it happens.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Then they go to the gas tanks, they set the timers, set them for 6 minutes. We know Bond actually sets them for 3 minutes because they get caught by Ormov. Okay, here's the big thing with this. Is Alec Trevelyan's death faked or not faked? At the end of the day, this is a story choice that works best the less you think about it. And when you start diving into the logistics of what happened, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's kind of just movie magic, and what happens is what needs to happen to make the story interesting. I'm just going to add a couple points here. This most likely wasn't staged, and Alec actually got shot in the head by Ormov. First of all, we know the gun isn't full of blanks because Ormov shoots one of his own men when Bond is moving to the conveyor belt to escape. And secondly, in the DVD commentary with Martin Campbell and Michael G. Wilson, they note that there is intended to be a shooting in the head, and they had to cut it out because the censors wouldn't allow it. There's supposed to be a bullet going into his head. And that would also be why there's no blood on the ground. Censors wouldn't allow it. No blood. So it seems the logical conclusion is that Bond and Alec both go to the Archangel chemical weapons facility to blow it up. They get caught unknowingly. Bond changes the timer to 3 minutes, escapes. Ormov shoots Alec in the head. Ormov and his men run outside, and the thing blows up. But before that, when Ormov's men run outside, Alec wakes up. He's like, oh, I gotta get out of here. It's getting ready to blow up. But don't worry, I got 6 minutes. And he starts going, and then poof, his face gets burned because he didn't have 6 minutes. He had 3 minutes. And just like that, Bond betrays him. And then the Soviets find his shot in the head, burned face, mangled body. They nurse him back to health and imprison him in the gulag. Somehow he gets Stockholm Syndrome or something. And Ormov defects. And they end up working together in the Yanis group. Man, a lot can happen in 6 years. All right, and then Bond manages to escape despite this very squeaky wheel. And boom, we have the second awesome stunt in this pre-title sequence. We're not even sitting at 10 minutes into this movie. And this is all real. The stuntman just drove this off the cliff. When Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning was coming out, they were hyping up Tom Cruise doing this exact same thing. Okay, look, here, they did it earlier. They did it 25 years earlier. Also, this shot is a painting with the cutout of a runway. Catches the plane, saves the plane from the dive bomb, and then boom, explodes into the pre-title sequence. Really, really good. We got a record-breaking 720-foot bungee jump 2 minutes in, and then less than 10 minutes in, we got this crazy thing. Original pre-title sequence, original draft of Goldeneye. It's completely different from what we have in the final product. Here, Bond is working security on a futuristic, computer-controlled magnet bullet train, speeding 300 miles per hour through the French countryside. Probably the inspiration from Monaco after the title sequence. Also on this train just happens to be a character that would be Natalia, but in this script she's called Marina, who designed the train and the Goldeneye/Tempest weapon system. The train gets rigged with explosives and assaulted by a helicopter. Natalia saves the passenger section by decoupling the passenger car, and Bond drives his Aston Martin DB7 out of the auto ferry onto the top and front of the train, knocks the helicopter onto the nose of the train, and it all explodes. And then Bond outruns the explosion. Then he picks up a girl. No offense, Michael France. This is cool and all, but this is not as good as what we got. Also, I'm just saying, Mission Impossible 1 with Tom Cruise came out 1 year after this. Take a look at the climax sequence of that compared to this script. Very similar. All right, the title scene. The title sequence, typical Bond fanfare. You got naked women, you got flashy visuals, you got guns, you got explosions. Overall, visually, it's excellent. You got girls in bikinis destroying communist monuments. What more could a guy want? The song is good. It's sung by Tina Turner. It was written by Bono and The Edge of U2. Is it the best title song? No. Is it the worst title song? No. Oh, Jack White. It's reported that the Rolling Stones turned down the title song. It's reported that Depeche Mode turned down the title song. Ace of Base, this is like a Swedish pop band, submitted a song. It was turned down. And Tina Turner said Bono gave her this horribly sung demo of Goldeneye. The demo's out there. It's not that bad. I think she's being a little dramatic.
On the wind, I feel his breath. With a golden eye, I'll find his weakness.
We are thrust into the narrative 9 years later after the incident in Archangel in the mountains of French Monaco. Bond is supposedly being evaluated by a psychologist, but I don't really understand how an immortal figure of the late 20th century Western capitalist man of material, exposed to the excess all forms, endless cycles of cheap pleasure and cheap death, can be evaluated by a woman scared of him driving too fast. And we see the answer to that question. She can't. She succumbs to his charm. Here we're introduced to Famke Janssen as Xenia.
Xenia Sergeyevna Onatov.
Fun fact, right here after this shot, the Aston Martin crashes into the Ferrari and they spent 80 grand fixing that overnight. And this is also the place we get the first taste of Eric Serra's soundtrack really in full force. The soundtrack of this movie is by far the greatest misstep. They supposedly tried to get John Barry to do this movie. He scored the last 11 Bond movies. Tina Turner's title song is good. No complaints there. But I don't know what they were thinking letting this guy do the soundtrack and why they signed off on this. Even Martin Campbell says that he was disappointed with the soundtrack. In fact, they have to change the soundtrack in the tank chase. We'll get to that later.
3 or 4 composers turned this film down before we'd shot it. Eric Serra, and I just thought, in keeping with bringing Bond up to date, he would be a perfect candidate for it. Yeah, let me be honest, I was not that happy with the music in the film. I was disappointed in it.
Really, this scene is just checking off boxes, letting us know Bond is back. We got cars, we got ladies, we got product placement. Then we're right into another Bond classic. The Monte Carlo Casino. We got Bond in his tux. We got Bond saying his line.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Xenia flips over 007. And then Bond flips over 006. Ooh. We're finally introduced to Xenia Onatop.
Xenia Sergeyevna Onatop.
And she's got that classic double entendre name.
On the top?
On the top.
There's really no contest here.
My name is Pussy Galore.
Xenia Onatopp is the best Bond girl in any of the movies. She's utterly chaotic evil, absolute sadist, ruthless monster, a dominatrix Black Widow, eyeshadow and red lipstick, death and sex, smoking a cigar, not a cigarette. How much more indulgent can you get here? A henchman that kills men with her thighs. As a continuation of the characterization from the car chase in the casino, we see the third thing that Xenia and Bond have in common. It's the hanky-panky. And interestingly, whereas in prior movies they merely suggested it, the first explicit sex scene in a Bond franchise movie does not include Bond. Fun fact, in Michael France's original draft of the movie, Xenia does not kill her victims in the same manner. Rather, she uses some fancy hand technique kung fu things to induce heart attacks in her victims. It seems really similar to the 5-point palm exploding heart technique from Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill. But yeah, we love it. This is better.
It's terrible. I can't bring my 6- and 7-year-olds to see Bond.
They put him in the hospital, if I remember correctly. Martin, do you remember this?
Just took it to the limit. The actor died.
Yeah, I can't breathe.
Bond investigates the Manticore yacht from the intel that he got from Moneypenny. There's this great little shot where Bond sees an attacking henchman in the reflection of a bit of polished metal before proceeding to incapacitate the man. This is nice because it kind of gives us insight as into the mind of the character, that hyper-aware state of the secret agent, always alert, trained to notice those small details that may grant him that edge in life or death situations. And just a little bit of commentary here on this first chunk of story, from the post-title sequence to pre-Severnaya. There hasn't been any exposition or explanation of what Bond is doing. We don't know why he's in Monaco, why he stumbled upon Xenia, why he's so interested in Xenia. Bond's just kind of diddling around, being a bit of a voyeur. Are we, as the audience, supposed to infer that Bond's fatal flaw, his primal lust for women, is some type of compass that supernaturally leads him to secret plots that only he can stop? Honestly, this opening section after the title sequence is probably the slowest part of the movie, and upon rewatch, this is always the part that feels like it drags. Severnaya. Framing the opening with these dogs that Natalia's going to use to dog sled all the way back to St. Petersburg. We get our first introduction to the other leading Bond lady, Natalia, alongside Boris. This Severnaya scene with Boris and Natalia was the very first day of shooting of Goldeneye. They're both kind of two sides of the same coin, both computer programmers, but one goes to the light side, one goes to the dark side. We got more X-Wave post-feminist sexist comments with these ladies hating on Boris's joke.
He wouldn't know a woman if one came up and sat on his head.
Boris is kind of like Alec Trevelyan's Q, but instead of gadgets, he's conjuring financial meltdown spells. Also, his punchline is hilarious.
I am invincible!
Natalia is a particularly interesting Bond girl. She both has an antagonist, Boris Grishenko, and she has a plot arc, overcoming Boris with superior computer hacking. Most Bond girls don't get plot arcs or special skills. Between Natalia and Xenia, we can really see how the heads of this movie put a lot of effort into developing female characters to another level for the first time in a Bond movie. All these outside shots are completely fake. They're all miniatures, forced perspective, and CGI. Great work by Derek Meddings. We see Xenia coming in with Oromov on the Tiger Eurocopter. We haven't seen him since the pre-title sequence, so we can really feel the plot starting to pick up some momentum here. We finally see Xenia's special kink, firmly identifying her as a villain. A pointed note in the story here is we don't actually know who the antagonist is. Xenia's the only person that's done something remotely bad, and she's tied back to this general who we know from the pre-title sequence, but the audience really has no idea how this is connected at this point. I think this is a bit of a weakness of the film. It doesn't really have weight until you understand that Yanis is 006. They test fire Goldeneye. We get some of the first CGI in any Bond movie ever. The EMP, Natalia survives, and then dog sleds are way on back. Michael France OG script. In the original script, the slaughter here is led by Trevelyan, not Xenia, and this is the audience's first introduction to Trevelyan, but Trevelyan hasn't been shown this point in the OG script. There's no explicit connection to Trevelyan and Bond for the viewer. That's revealed later. Bond gets back to MI6, flirts with Moneypenny. It's kind of strange how on one hand she mentions sexual harassment while flippantly flirting with Bond on the other hand. If you can't tell at this point, I'm really not a fan of all this Bond is a sexist stuff in escapist entertainment with a male action hero for a masculine audience. Who are they trying to make feel better with this stuff? The ladies that got dragged here with their husbands and boyfriends? It feels like an elaborate humiliation ritual, along with this whole thing with M and Bond.
I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur.
We unfortunately see this trend continue to accelerate through the rest of Brosnan's tenure and to the end of Craig's tenure, culminating with a woman taking on the 007 mantle and James Bond, archetypal man, dying. Quite the stark contrast from merely 30 years ago.
Liar.
They want to redefine women's roles in Bond films, but then they introduce a new M as a woman, and then of course her and Bond don't get along. I don't understand why this introduction with this underlying animosity was thought to be a good choice of direction for this character. This isn't a woman don't like Bond film, this is a Bond film. There's a little bit of counterweight here. M says Bond is a relic of the Cold War.
A relic of the Cold War.
Kind of suggesting he's not needed anymore. The thing is, by the end of the movie, Bond clearly proves her wrong. If he's not needed, then why is she sending him on a mission? And this is a meta theme of the movie. How does Bond fit in this modern post-Soviet world? So I guess M is supposed to be kind of like the envoy of the audience's voice to Bond. Then M secretly likes Bond and doesn't want him to die.
Bond? Come back alive.
By the way, in the script, M's real name is Barbara Maudsley. We get Ourumov trying to sweep stuff under the rug. Michigan ain't having it. Ourumov has an interesting thematic parallel with Bond here. He's a relic of the Cold War at the time of the Soviet at its height, when it was at its most prestigious, surrounded by men in this council of the post-Soviet age, making him obsolete. And we get our Q scene. Desmond Llewellyn is clearly having a blast here. This scene is full of energy, the most fun scene in the movie. Q, the wizard that arms the Bond warrior with spells and gadgets for his voyage into the realm of darkness. Look at the twinkle in his eye. He loves this. There is crazy stuff happening in the background, constantly people flying all over the place. One thing I really like about Goldeneye is it straddles that razor edge of realistic and totally off-the-wall fantastical gadgets in Bond films. The laser watch is right on that line. The repelling watch right on that line. Exploding pen, 3 clicks. Perfect! They just get crazier after this with Brosnan. We get an invisible car in a couple movies. We also get a bit of a gag, reversal gag in this. At the start, Bond thinks the cast isn't a gadget, and Q shows him it is. And then at the end, Bond thinks the sandwich is definitely a gadget, and Q's like, that's not a gadget, that's my lunch.
Don't touch that! It's my lunch.
Oh, Desmond, we love you. We also see Bond's BMW with the Stinger missiles that he never actually uses in the film. Martin Campbell said that the reason this happened is because the deal was done quite late. They kind of just had to shove the BMW in wherever they could in the movie. It was too late to really do anything with it, have any action scenes. So Bond is just left with an impotent BMW. All right, after this Q scene, we're about halfway through the runtime of Goldeneye. I don't know about the rest of you, but I personally think the first act of Goldeneye is not paced super well. It's pretty slow. Bond's just kind of standing around, not really doing much of anything. Bond the wallflower, just kind of existing as a fly on the wall to the plot. Come on, Bond, do something. In the DVD commentary, Martin Campbell says that he thinks the first act of Goldeneye is poorly paced and quite slow as well.
And I think people like the action.
Bond goes to Russia, meets his American contact, Jack Wade. I never really found Jack Wade to be that interesting of a character. The best thing about him is his little tattoo. Fun fact, Joe Don Baker played a villain in The Living Daylights, so basically only him and Desmond Llewellyn are holdovers from old Bond. Joe Don Baker's playing a different character here, so Q is really the only continuous character actor holdover. Jack Wade's name is an homage to Kevin Wade, who did that 3-week rewrite of Michael France's original script, but he got no credit in the credits. Michael France's original script. There is no Jack Wade. Instead, Bond meets a Russian named Valentin. His nickname is Romali. That character's in that version of the movie a lot more than Jack Wade. He's killed a little bit before a scene that is analogous to the tank chase through St. Petersburg by a Yanis baddie. And now we get Valentin Zukovsky, Hagrid. I personally love Valentin, and I love that Valentin comes back in The World Is Not Enough. The actor, Robbie Coltrane, can strike this great balance of being hilarious and also incredibly threatening at exactly the same time. Just magnetic screen presence. This is also the very first scene that Pierce Brosnan shot for Goldeneye. Day one of shooting for him. There's a little deleted scene that was cut from the movie where Zukovsky's kind of evaluating some guns, setting him up as an arms dealer. I personally wish it was in because I love Valentin, but I can see why they cut it. As I just said, the first act was really dragging, and this is getting close to the point where the movie starts to finally pick up. Valentin sets up Yanis, Leon's Cossack, Trevelyan's theme of betrayal, and agrees to introduce Bond to Yanis in exchange for a big old pile of money.
I love gold!
And honestly, the balls on Bond to come to this guy that he shot in the knee. We get this sauna scene and this beautiful set. This set is fully constructed inside of a soundstage for the movie. This isn't a real location. Absolutely gorgeous. Bond finally has his reintroduction to Xenia, and she is a bad, bad girl. She tries to give it to him like the Admiral. Fun fact, all the walls in this room are rubber tiles, and Pierce Brosnan still broke one of Famke Janssen's ribs, tossing her around. And it's funny, after all this is over, she's just mad.
Hard. Just throw me, toss me against that wall. I stopped breathing at that point. I broke my rib.
Michael France OG script. In his script, there is this whole other sequence that isn't in the movie. So we get this sauna scene, and it culminates with Bond and Xenia actually doing the deed to kill time before she takes him to Trevelyan. Instead of the statue yard, Bond is led to a trap involving a sarin gas derivative in the maintenance tunnels of the KGB headquarters. This then more or less leads into that nuclear missile silo sequence from The World Is Not Enough, where basically Boris Grishenko and General Oromov are planning on setting off a nuclear warhead to kind of get a feel for what a Goldeneye blast would be like. While investigating this silo, Bond is knocked out. He wakes up surrounded by hundreds of warheads, tied up next to Natalia. Bond gets in a scuffle. During the scuffle, he whacks Oromov in the leg, causes Oromov to misfire his gun and kills Boris Grishenko. And then there's a chain reaction of the warheads. Bond and Natalia escape just in time through some blast doors, and Oromov is incinerated. This climax is what ultimately gets toned down into the Tiger Eurocopter destruction sequence, and then feeds back into the capture by the forces of the character that is written into Defense Minister Mishkin. So Xenia takes Bond to this awesome scene, this graveyard of decrepit Soviet monuments, just oozing with atmosphere. And this is a completely fabricated set. They just built this. Fun fact, the original shot of Bond rabbit punching Xenia was cut for the censors. And then we get the big reveal. Ah, what a great twist. How often do we get good twists like this in a Bond movie? So basically everything about Alec Trevelyan and the Trevelyan family legacy is rooted in betrayal. They were Leanne's Cossacks, so they were basically Russians that betrayed Russians to fight with Nazis against Russians. Then the Nazis lost, so the British sent the Leanne's Cossacks back to Russia, quote unquote, betraying them, and then Russia slaughtered almost all of them for treason, quote unquote, betraying them. Alec's father kills himself, kind of betraying him. He gets picked up by the British to be a secret agent, the people that, quote unquote, betrayed the Leanne's Cossacks. And then when he and Bond are on a mission in Archangel, Bond betrays him, quote unquote, by changing the timers from 6 minutes to 3 minutes. Some time passes, and then Alec Trevelyan betrays the British by becoming the head of the Yanis crime syndicate, the exact thing that MI6 works to defeat, and their arms dealers. I love this. I think this is great characterization. It's simple yet complicated, and you can kind of see where this guy is coming from. A series of very, very unfortunate events. Trevelyan, of course, has that classic facial deformity characteristic of so many Bond villains. Trevelyan is probably one of the most, or the most deadly and dangerous villain that Bond has ever faced, being a former MI6 agent. The only villain I can think of that's kind of on par with him, the assassin of assassins and 00 killer himself, Francisco Scaramanga. So Alec clearly doesn't really give a hoo-ha about Bond. He probably just wanted to see the look on his face seeing he's still alive. They poison dart him, which is a little bit silly, but it kind of fits, like the idea that he was once an MI6 agent. This kind of seems like a Q gadget. And he says, "Closing time, James."
Closing time, James.
Which is a reference back to the pre-title sequence. Alex said this before he was captured by Ourumov. And then he also gives that mocking, "For England, James."
For England, James.
Which he also said in the pre-title sequence. I think a lot of these repetitive quips and dialogue
It's like poetry.
are just kind of a way to characterize 006 and 007's relationship, contextualize that they used to be friends. Overall, this scene is fantastic. It's one of the best scenes in the entire film. The set is amazing. We get this giant plot twist. We finally see our villain's face. If I had any critique, it would just be, I wish this scene was longer and more tension was built up. Give me more cake, please.
You like that?
And then Bond wakes up in the Tiger Eurocopter with Natalia. I don't really have too much to say about this. It's good that it's here. This movie really could use some adrenaline after for how long it's been on a downbeat. It is kind of funny when Bond helps Natalia out of the Eurocopter. Instead of a thank you, she just boom, kneecaps him. They immediately get captured by Mishkin to the Gulag. Some boring characterization. There's some really good acting here. Mishkin and Bond arguing over what the heck is going on. And then Ourumov comes in. This is the point where the movie steps on the gas and we are going to the end. Ourumov domes Mishkin. The fact that Ourumov does this is crazy. This would be the equivalent of a general just shooting a US president. Plans to blame it on Bond. And then finally we get some gunfire. This sequence is exhilarating. This is the longest action sequence in the movie. We finally get to hear the iconic Bond theme music. Bullets shooting up through the metal rafters builds a lot of great tension. I think the movie could have benefited from having an additional gun-based sequence like this somewhere else in the story. Michael France. In the original script, after Bond and Natalia are captured by Mishkin, Trevelyan attacks with a helicopter and Bond and Natalia flee on skis. And while they're fleeing on skis, they're being chased by a helicopter wielding buzzsaws. This is exactly the helicopter you're thinking of. They reuse this idea in The World Is Not Enough. Well, not reuse, but you know what I mean. And then we get this epic chase through St. Petersburg. The fact that they shot some of this in Russia right after the Soviet Union collapsed is pretty awesome, although apparently most of the shots were actually done on a set that they built. This statue on top of the tank thing is hilarious. Great idea by Martin Campbell. It's kind of one of those silly swagger gags that feels like something out of the Roger Moore movies. And I gotta talk about the music in this. So you may have noticed the music in this sequence does not match the music in the rest of the movie. And that is because Eric Serra scored this track for this sequence, and then apparently the music was in the same mode as all the sound effects of the explosions in the tank, so it was just a big muddy mess. The producers and Martin Campbell hated it, so they sent the already finalized cut of the scene to John Altman to try to do something to salvage this sequence. You can find the original track of this. It's called A Pleasant Drive in St. Petersburg. It sounds like moody trip hop. I'm gonna say too, it's not a pleasant drive. So at least we got some brassy Bond themes somewhere in this movie. And in a way, it seems to elevate this scene even a little bit more because the rest of the music doesn't sound like this. Really just sealing it as an iconic moment in Goldeneye. Michael France! In the original treatment of the story, the chase through St. Petersburg is on horseback and culminates with Xenia choking Natalia's character, Marina, with a garrote. Bond and Xenia then exchange a few blows before Xenia gets the upper hand on Bond, attempting to induce a heart attack with her special hand techniques before Natalia shoots her dead. So in this version, Boris, Ourumov, and Xenia are now dead. So the solution for this was to have an additional henchman that Bond would fight before Trevelyan at the climax. That character basically shoots Jack Wade's character with a sniper rifle here. We get this awesome sequence where Bond stops a train with a tank. This train is all miniature work. Again, fantastic miniature work in this movie. I really don't know why nowadays we don't use miniatures. This stuff looks so much better than CGI. We get a good old Mexican standoff. Bond kills Ourumov to save Natalia. Alec and Xenia get away. And then we get that nice little nod back to the start with the timers. 6 minutes, 3 minutes. We get some great gadget work. Natalia helps locate the secret base. I just always thought it was weird how the bad guys escape in a helicopter after they just blew up the Tiger Eurocopter. It just kind of feels like wonky writing to have this new helicopter that's not like the old fancy helicopter that the bad guys escape in so soon after the last one was blown up. Michael France's script has even more helicopters. Tinfoil hat time. What's up with all these helicopters in Goldeneye? Famke Janssen was apparently frustrated that she didn't have any lines in this scene, and Martin Campbell told her that you don't need lines to be effective. I think this shot of her getting up after the crash really proves him right. And that's the end of Act 2. We've really started to pick up the momentum in this movie, and it doesn't really stop until it's over, except for a brief breather when they get to Cuba. Act 2 is a lot stronger than Act 1. We got Valentin Zukovsky. We have the awesome statue yard, the reveal with Trevelyan, the big gun sequence in the archives, and then the iconic tank chase through St. Petersburg, and this awesome train Mexican standoff sequence, harkening back to the timers that entangled Bond and Trevelyan's fate together. Betrayal. Cuba! Bond and Natalia in Cuba looking for the Yanis secret base, driving that product placement BMW. Gotta fit it in however we can, everybody. For some reason, they bring Jack Wade back. I'm assuming this is because they're supposed to be in Cuba, and Cuba is a big communist place, and it's near the US. This scene is fluff and not really important. And then Wade gets Bond's BMW car with the Stinger missiles. I find the fact that Bond does not use his supercar in the movie flaccid. And then we get another slow scene here with Bond and Natalia on the beach, trying to humanize Bond a little bit, try to have a little romance. Really, the screen makers are just giving the audience a breather before we get into the action-packed finale. This part of the movie, before they get in the plane to go scouting, reminds me of Act 1. Frankly, it's just droll. Michael Wilson was apparently skeptical about this beach Bond Natalia scene because it was such a departure from Bond. Apparently there's supposed to be some type of allegory to the old poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, as well. I'm not really sure that would have made this any better. Bond doesn't really strike me as the poetry type. Also, I don't think the actors have very good chemistry, especially if you compare their chemistry to Pierce Brosnan and Famke Janssen. So they get in the plane and go scouting for the base. The plane gets shot down. The shot where it looks like Bond is supposed to be drifting in and out of consciousness was always strange to me. I just always thought it looked like he was trying to take a nap. We get the final showdown with Xenia. She tries to squeeze Bond one last time. Xenia meets a fitting end. Live by the sword, die by the sword, as she is crushed to death. The last shot of her up in the tree is interesting. It always reminds me of crucifixion for some reason. Then the satellite rises up out of the fake lake. The lake drains. Again, fantastic miniature work. It kind of just seems like they were thinking, how do we get Bond into this control room as fast as possible for the sake of pacing? The lair's all right. It's kind of cool to think that the Cuban communists had this big secret underground computer lair. Bond and Natalia get captured. But first, Natalia completes her plot arc by out-leak coding Boris and Bond rigging some bombs. And then Trevelyan does the classic evil villain thing where he describes his plan right before he kills him. There's a cool parallel here again where Trevelyan compares each of their Q watches. It's also product placement for Amiga. In the original script, Trevelyan's target was the World Trade 7+211 towers rather than London, willing to trade 1 million lives for $6 billion. Merely dust on the globe. And then Q's clicky pen comes in. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. The tension. Click, click, click. And boom, boom, boom. They're off. They're going up to the transmitter. We got our final showdown. Martin Campbell says that the inspiration for the fisticuffs between Bond and Trevelyan was from Russia with Love, specifically the train scene. That close quarter aspects was something he really aimed to emulate. It's a good scene. It's intense. It's brutal. It looks like it freaking hurts. And Trevelyan gets the upper hand on Bond, but wait. Then they fall down to that little bottom part. Tension, tension, tension. Just fantastic directing and editing here, ratcheting up the tension in the fight. Bond gets the upper hand, and Trevelyan goes flying off, but Bond grabs him by the foot. And Trevelyan isolates the element that wedges between their two characters. Despite all their similarities and shared history, what makes Bond 007 and what makes Alec Trevelyan, Yanis, different?
For England, James?
For England, James. Trevelyan has processed Bond's refusal to join him in the control room, thinking it is out of loyalty or duty to England. A mocking statement from Trevelyan's perspective, whose legacy has endured multiple betrayals by British, allies, friends, family, country. How could a man like this ever become anything other than what he is? How could he ever still be loyal? Alec's conclusion to confront the darkness of the world and the bitterness in his heart is to tear down the entities that wronged him and bury his hatred under a pile of gold that would make Goldfinger blush. How could he ever not become this hedonist monster? This is why he mocks Bond. He knows Bond knows this. And if Bond knows this, and Bond understands, then how can Bond possibly be loyal? It is foolish to be sent here to your death, used and betrayed by the same people that used and betrayed the Trevelyans. So he takes Bond for a fool. He's just a brainwashed tool, following orders for the same people that used them both. There's nothing in it for him. It's just business. And then Bond replies,
No.
"No, for me." In this moment, Bond confronts his doppelganger, a man so much like him, a path he could have taken. A scrying mirror, a Bond gone bad in the name of narcissistic bitterness, revenge, and piles of money. He could save 006. an act of kindness for an old friend and colleague. Spare him death and give him over to the British monolith to be judged, just as his parents and the Cossacks were. Maintain order, the status quo, perceived British civility and due process. No, no, no. Bond looks into this mirror and integrates the darkness he sees. He feels that stink of betrayal just as well as Alec does, but not from Britain, but from Alec, his old friend. He doesn't kill Alec just because England wants him to. He kills Alec because he hurts just as Alec does. And despite how awfully true that is, Bond chooses to do the right thing for the greater world. Because that's what the world needs, and that's what he needs. And it's also what Alec needs. An integration of both Bond and Alec's feelings and motivations into a synchronous path towards a better world. Revenge. Bond succeeds in personal revenge, where Alec fails.
James? For England. For England, James. For England, James?
For England, Alec. No. For me.
In the original Michael France script, the overall beats of the climax between Bond and Natalia in Trevelyan's secret control room lair play out fairly similarly. In this version, Natalia's wrench in the plans actually caused Goldeneye to reroute and explode upon the evil lair. This happens while Bond is fighting the last of Yanis's significant henchmen. This one was left out of the final movie, Savitar. He's the one that shoots Jack Wade around when they have the horse/tank chase through St. Petersburg. It seems to me like this is the henchman that's supposed to fulfill that physically intimidating role, like a Jaws or like an Odd Job. You just can't take him out by punching him. Goldeneye goes off and he gets electrocuted to death. And then Bond and Trevelyan fight on some catwalks, and Bond knocks a panel loose and Trevelyan falls to his death. And then the Tiger helicopter hasn't been destroyed in this version, so Bond and Natalia rush to it as the evil lair is exploding, and then they reboot it and escape just in the nick of time before the base explodes all around them. And then there's one little funny joke that I really like. There's a beat back to MI6 where Q and M mull on what type of terrible survival conditions Bond must be subject to in a fallout from an EMP blast. And we cut to Bond and Natalia lounging, and Bond is dismayed by being given a stirred, not shaken martini. Ha ha. And then we close out the movie, and we see Boris one last time, narrowly escaping death, and then not. And by the cruel hand of fate, Boris suffers the fate in Cuba that he had evaded in Russia, having a radio telescope fall on him and then frozen to death. This shot of Bond leaping and grabbing the helicopter was the last shot of filming. Bond and Natalia jump into Jack Wade and Marines, and everything is good again. Until the credits roll to this terrible song, written and sung by Eric Serra. And that's Goldeneye. So, after this 6-year gap, and following the failure that was Licensed to Kill, Bond's main villain, the Soviet Union, gone from the world stage, did Goldeneye have what it takes? Were they able to pull it off and reinvent Bond?
The stakes were so high, we needed to get it right. It really was an exhilarating time of anxiety and high expectations.
Was Goldeneye the golden-eyed goose that saved James Bond? You better believe it. Upon its release to the public in 1995, Goldeneye was received extremely favorably by both critics and audiences alike. The most successful Bond since Moonraker, and grossing over 80% more than the failure that was Licensed to Kill. To this day, Goldeneye is still looked upon as one of the best Bond movies ever made, alongside other classics like Goldfinger, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, The Spy Who Loved Me, and Casino Royale. Goldeneye is a flawed masterpiece. It has a great story, redefining Bond in this post-Soviet world. A killer twist, a friend or villain who isn't dead. And Pierce Brosnan gives a strong debut performance as James Bond. A touch of Moore's campy quips, a dash of Dalton's cold lethality, the collectedness of Connery, and maybe a touch of romance from Lazenby. I will say that Brosnan seems a little stiff in the role. In the later Bond films, he grows much more into the character. It's too bad that character was stuck with those scripts. Great atmospheric sets and locations, like the creepy statue yard. It has fantastic characters. The intimidating Valentin Zukovsky, Desmond Llewellyn back as Q, Natalia Simonova, who had her very own plot arc and antagonist. Fantastic villains, a bitter Alec Trevelyan, a wacky Boris Grishenko, the best Bond femme fatale Xenia Onatopp, scintillating gadgets like the laser watch, striking that balance between realistic and a hint of the fantastical. The biggest misstep in this movie is the soundtrack by Eric Serra. Somehow, he won a BMI Film Award for the soundtrack. The soundscape just does not fit the vibe of the movie, an experiment better left unreplicated. Bond also lacks agency in the first half of the movie. He doesn't end up doing much until he gets to Russia. The first act of the movie is quite slow. It drags, alongside some other filler, such as the beach sequence in Cuba prior to the climax of the movie, or the opening car chase with Xenia. And the movie's a little light on the action. They really should have considered cutting out some of these filler scenes and adding in one more high-intensity, adrenaline-pumping gunfight like the archive sequence. In addition, the meta-commentary by female characters on Bond's purported sexism
I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur.
does not belong in male action hero fantasy. And the BMW deal, Bond just never got a chance to use those Stinger missiles. Pierce Brosnan goes on to do 3 more Bond movies. Overall, his Bond filmography can best be described as mixed. I personally am a big fan of The World Is Not Enough. And After Die Another Day, I think they broke him off 1 or 2 movies too early. Fortunately, he did play Bond in a number of James Bond video games. Some of them are really great, like Agent Under Fire, Nightfire, and Everything or Nothing. Everything or Nothing feels like the final Brosnan movie, evil world-ending nanobots, and William Dafoe as the villain. And speaking of video games, how could I forget to talk about? Yeah, you know. Goldeneye 007 for the N64. It came out 2 years after Goldeneye in 1997, shortly before the release of Brosnan's second movie, Tomorrow Never Dies. This game is an absolute legend, defining what first-person shooters could be on a game console. Back before the days of the internet, kids would stay up all night, eating pizza and shooting each other in Goldeneye. Slappers only, proximity mines, bunker, facility, complex. My squad's personal favorite was Temple, man with the golden gun. Many fights were had over Oddjob, usually people just choosing to ban him, or if you were like my friend group, everyone would race to the character select screen and try to pick him first. The single player was also great. It loosely followed the plot of the movie, and it was really cool how you would get different objectives depending on the difficulty of the mission you played on. You could also unlock all these cool cheats and weapons for beating a level at a given difficulty in a certain time frame. Some of these were insane, like beating Facility in 2 minutes for invincibility. And once you beat Trevelyan in the cradle, you would unlock those 2 hidden stages, Aztec and Egypt, with Jaws and Baron Samedi. It really cannot be overstated how monumental and influential the Goldeneye game on N64 was, not just for video games, but Goldeneye. It unquestionably boosted the Goldeneye movie's relevance in the cultural zeitgeist. Decades later, this game is still looked upon as a seminal work. It even spawned 2 terrible remakes, purely piggybacking off the Goldeneye name. In 2004, Goldeneye Rogue Agent, terrible. And then Goldeneye 007 in 2010, also terrible. Both of these derivative products bear virtually no resemblance to the original 1997 game or movie, but exist on the shoulders of giants, parasitizing and capitalizing a title of enduring greatness, Goldeneye. The original Goldeneye game would even be re-released on Xbox and Nintendo Switch in January 2023. I still get flashbacks of rage having to rotate controllers with the 5th wheel because one of my friends kept picking Odd Job and running up to me and slapping me all over the place, and I couldn't shoot him because I didn't know how to look down. The game is a fascinating anomaly as to how a piece of addendum media can synergistically amplify the legacy of its primary work. And that primary work was a very special work, a work that saved James Bond, Goldeneye.